The last years of the Ming Dynasty felt like walking across a bridge made of old wood. Each step sounded fine, but deep down everyone knew the next plank might snap. China, once proud and steady, was beginning to wobble under its own weight. Villages sat under tired skies, fields gave less grain than before, and people carried the look of folks who had not slept well in years. The cracks didn't appear all at once. They formed slowly, creeping across the empire like tiny weeds growing through stone. If you walked through a small village in those days, you would hear everything. The cough of a hungry baby, the scrape of a hoe against stubborn earth, the tired laughter of old men who remembered better times. Many families lived meal to meal, always hoping the next harvest would be kinder. When storms came, roofs leaked. When winter arrived, bones ached. But even with all the hardship, people still pushed forward the way ordinary people always do, with sighs, jokes, and long days that ended with sore backs and simple dinners.
Far from the quiet villages, the big Ming cities were no better. Beijing, Nanjing, Suzhou, these places buzzed with life but also carried a heavy kind of noise, the noise of a tired country trying to look strong. Crowded markets were packed with people selling everything from rice to copper bowls to dreams that cost too much. The streets smelled of spice, sweat, and the stubborn smoke of 1,000 cooking fires. You could watch scholars rushing to exams, merchants arguing over silk prices, and soldiers trying to look important even though their pay was months late. But beneath the noise was a worry people were afraid to speak aloud. The dynasty had ruled for almost 300 years, and 300 years is a long time for anyone, especially an empire. Corruption ran through the government like cracks in old porcelain. Some officials worked hard and tried to be fair. Others worked hard at stealing as much as they could. Taxes rose, disasters struck, and each time the emperor ordered help, the silver often disappeared somewhere along the way into pockets that were never empty enough. Peasants felt the pressure most. Many had lived through droughts that killed crops before they even sprouted. Others had survived floods that washed entire villages away like sandcastles in the rain. After each disaster, people rebuilt because that's what people do. But by the late Ming, disaster after disaster stacked together like a pile of unpaid bills. Hunger pushed people toward anger. Anger pushed people toward rebellion. And rebellion, once started, is very hard to stop. Bandits roamed the countryside, sometimes acting like heroes, sometimes like villains, and sometimes like a little of both, depending on the day. Rebel groups grew like mushrooms after rain. One rebellion popped up in this province, another in that one. Each group promised justice and fairness, but most groups ended up taking whatever they could, leaving behind broken homes and exhausted hearts. For the ordinary farmer just trying to survive winter, it felt like every direction was dangerous.
Inside the imperial palace, things were not much better. The emperor, poor man, was drowning in paperwork, disasters, and sleepless nights. Every report he read brought another problem. Every messenger he met brought bad news. Somewhere between famine, rebellion, corruption, and war costs, he probably wondered how anyone was supposed to run a country this big. The weight of the empire sat on his shoulders like a backpack full of wet stones. Even nature seemed to join the rebellion. Winters became colder, storms stronger, summers harsher. Some called it the Little Ice Age. Others just called it one more problem. Crops refused to grow where they once thrived. Rivers froze that had not frozen in decades. People prayed, but the sky stayed silent. When the harvest failed, families packed their belongings, sometimes nothing more than a few bowls and a blanket, and walked toward the cities hoping for charity. The cities, already crowded, began to overflow. The streets of Beijing filled with refugees. Some sold tiny wooden carvings for a handful of coins. Others begged near temples, whispering prayers between shivers. The government tried to help sometimes, at least on paper. But paper solutions don't warm cold hands or fill empty stomachs. And in the middle of all this misery, rumours floated like dust in the wind. People whispered that far to the northeast, beyond the Great Wall, beyond the forests and icy rivers, a new power was rising. A people strong, disciplined, hungry, and united. Most villagers didn't know who these outsiders were. They only heard stories from travellers, stories of horsemen in thick fur coats, of archers who could hit a target while riding full speed, of leaders who seemed far calmer and more organized than anything the Ming government had managed in years. The whispers said this new force watched China the way a hawk watches a tired rabbit, patient, silent, waiting. Few understood just how close that new power had already come, or how soon China's long-time exhaustion would open the door for an empire that would rise from the cold north like a winter storm. If you travelled far to the northeast in the 1600s, past the Great Wall, past the dusty garrisons, past the tired farmers and the worn-out soldiers, you would eventually reach a world that felt like the edge of everything. This was Manchuria, a land of long winters, deep forests, wide rivers and mountains that stood like old guardians. It was not soft land. It did not spoil anyone, but it shaped the people who lived there into something strong, steady and sharp, like trees that learn to bend in storms instead of breaking. Life in Manchuria moved with the rhythm of nature. Summers were short and quick, like a polite visitor. Winters stayed longer than anyone wanted, sometimes roaring through the land with winds that could freeze a bucket of water in minutes. But the people, Manchus, Jurchens, hunters, herders, didn't complain much. Complaining didn't melt snow. Instead, they learned to work with the seasons. They hunted in the forests, fished in clear rivers, herded horses that seemed born from the cold wind, and built homes that could survive both storms and hungry wolves. A visitor from the Ming heartland would have been surprised by the quiet confidence of the Manchu people. They didn't build giant palaces or huge temples. Their wealth wasn't measured in silk or porcelain, but in strength, skill, discipline, and horses. Lots of horses. A good horse was better than most things money could buy, and a Manchu rider on a fast horse was one of the most dangerous things in Asia. These riders could fire arrows backward while galloping, which impressed everyone except the people being shot at. The forests were full of life, wild boar, deer, foxes, and the occasional tiger that looked at humans the way a hungry person looks at a steamed bun. Hunting was not a sport here. It was survival, training, and tradition rolled into one. Every young Manchu boy learned to track animals, read snow patterns, and move quietly enough to sneak up on prey without being noticed by either the prey or the tiger behind him. The land tested everyone every day, and those who passed its tests grew into people who feared very little. In this cold but beautiful land lived many tribes, each with its own customs but all sharing a strong sense of identity. Families stayed close. Loyalty meant everything. Decisions were made through councils, leaders were chosen for ability rather than fancy titles, and everyone worked together because winter did not care about anyone's ego. A lazy person in Manchuria did not stay lazy for long, because the cold had a way of teaching discipline faster than any teacher with a stick. But the most important thing in Manchu society, the thing that shaped their entire world, was the banner system. Though in these early days it wasn't yet the grand military machine it would become. A banner was more than a flag. It was a community, a military unit, a family, an identity. Every person belonged to one. The banner gave protection, purpose, and responsibility. In a land where survival depended on unity, this system made perfect sense. Strong families became strong banners. Strong banners became a strong people. The Manchus had something else working in their favour. They were very good at paying attention. They watched China, not with anger or jealousy, but with curiosity. They studied Ming politics, Ming weapons, Ming customs. They traded, they negotiated, they listened, and they learned. And every year, as China grew more tired, the Manchus grew more organised. They were like a quiet storm gathering strength behind the mountains, waiting for the right moment when the clouds would open and the world would change. Travellers passing through Manchuria often wrote about the people's toughness. One foreign visitor said the Manchus ate cold air for breakfast. Another claimed their horses slept standing in the snow and woke up stronger. These were exaggerations, of course, but only slightly. In a world where armies often struggled just to stay fed, the Manchus thrived in places that would have sent other soldiers running home to cry into their rice bowls. Still, life in Manchuria wasn't all hardship. There were warm fires, long meals, songs that told old stories, festivals where people danced in thick boots, and families who loved each other the same way families do everywhere. There was pride, humour, and a deep sense of belonging. And under all of this, under the laughter, the snow, the arrows, the horses, there was a rising awareness that their world was changing. Something big was beginning. Something that would reach far beyond the forests and the rivers. Because somewhere in this land, somewhere among the hunters, riders, traders, and elders, new leaders were emerging. Leaders who dreamed bigger than their ancestors. Leaders who believed the world beyond the mountains might be theirs one day. The Ming Dynasty to the south was trembling. The Manchus in the north were preparing. And though no one yet knew it, this cold, rugged land would soon give birth to an empire that would rule 1/3 of the world's population. The wind of change had started blowing, quiet at first, then stronger. Before the Qing Dynasty rose like a winter star on the horizon, it began with one man, Nurhaci. His name sounded simple, almost friendly, but his life was anything but small. If you lived in Manchuria in the late 1500s, you would have heard his name whispered near fires, spoken with respect in tents, or shouted proudly on hunting grounds. He wasn't born into power. He wasn't raised in comfort. He started the way many great leaders start, right in the middle of danger, loss, and a world that desperately needed someone brave enough to fix it. Nurhaci's early years were shaped by the same hardships that shaped every Manchu child. Cold winters, hard work, long hunts, and the constant reminder that the world never gives you anything for free. But for him, life took an even harder turn. When he was a young man, his father and grandfather were killed in a political conflict involving Ming officials and rival tribes. Most people would have carried that pain quietly for the rest of their lives. Nurhaci carried it too, but he also carried something else. Purpose. The kind that lights a fire bigger than grief. Nurhaci did not rush into revenge. He didn't charge into battle like a hero in a cheap story. Instead, he watched, learned, and waited. He studied how the clans around him worked. He studied their strengths and weaknesses. He studied the Ming government and how it behaved when it felt confident versus how it behaved when it felt scared. Slowly, quietly, patiently, he began pulling people toward him. Not by shouting, not by threats, but by showing that he was someone worth following. His first real step toward greatness came when he gathered a small group of followers, barely more than a handful, but he trained them with such discipline that soon people noticed. Then another group joined him, then another. Bit by bit, like threads twisting into a rope, the tribes began to unite under his leadership. He didn't force unity, he inspired it. He offered protection, justice, fairness, and something rare in those days, stability. People followed him because life near him simply felt safer. But leadership wasn't enough. To build something lasting, Nurhaci needed a system, something bigger than one man's charisma. And so, he created the early form of what later became the 8 Banners. It organized families, warriors, supplies, and duties in a way no one in the region had ever seen before. Under this system, everyone knew their role. Everyone had a purpose, and when Nurhaci called, they moved like fingers of the same hand. Nurhaci also had a gift for diplomacy. Some leaders used fear, others used charm. Nurhaci used both, carefully. When he met rival tribes, he didn't walk in waving weapons. He walked in with respect. He offered alliances, marriages, trade, protection, and fairness. And when someone betrayed him, which happened more than once, he responded quickly and decisively, reminding everyone that kindness wasn't the same as weakness. By balancing firmness with wisdom, he pulled tribe after tribe into his growing union. As Nurhaci's power grew, the Ming Dynasty to the south didn't pay much attention at first. They thought of him as just another northern chieftain, one of many. But as the years passed, his organization, discipline, and territory grew too large to ignore. When Ming officials finally realized the size of the storm building in Manchuria, it was already too late. Nurhaci had united more tribes than anyone expected. His followers multiplied, his horses multiplied, his weapons multiplied, even his children multiplied. He had plenty of those too. Nurhaci's next move was bold. He took every grievance his people had suffered, against Ming officials, against corrupt traders, against rival tribes, and he wrote them down into what became known as the 7 Great Grievances. This wasn't just a list of complaints, it was a declaration, a statement of why he would no longer bow to Ming authority. It was the spark that lit the fuse, and once the fuse burned down, there was no going back. War followed, but it was not chaotic or wild. Nurhaci fought with strategy. He used speed, discipline, and unity. He chose battles he could win and avoided ones he couldn't. His forces moved like a single creature, fast, flexible, and frighteningly efficient. Ming armies, tired and stretched thin, had trouble keeping up. Victory by victory, year by year, Nurhaci carved out a new nation from the frozen earth, something powerful enough to one day reshape all of China. Near the end of his life, Nurhaci had already changed history. He didn't live long enough to see his people conquer Beijing or rule the empire, but none of that could have happened without him. He was the spark, the architect, the first stone in a towering wall. Everything the Qing Dynasty became, its strengths, its culture, its stability, began with him. And in the cold mountains of Manchuria, where his story started, his legacy lingered like a warm fire in a long winter night. Before the Qing Dynasty conquered China, before it pushed past the Great Wall and marched into Beijing, its true strength came from something quiet, clever, and organized: the 8 banners. These banners were not just flags flapping in the wind, they were the entire backbone of Manchu life. Military system, social structure, identity, and community all wrapped together. If Nurhaci was the spark that lit the fire, the 8 banners were the hands that kept the fire steady and bright. Imagine living in a world where your whole life, your house, your work, your training, even your friends, were grouped under the same coloured banner. That was how the Manchus lived. People weren't just random citizens wandering around. They belonged to a banner the way a branch belongs to a tree. It wasn't restrictive. It was comforting. When trouble came, you knew exactly who would ride beside you. When winter arrived, you shared food, warmth, and help with the same families who fought beside you. It was community on a level most societies could only dream of. There were banners for Manchus, banners for Mongols, and later banners for Han Chinese who joined the growing movement. Every banner had its own colour: yellow, white, red, blue, and some had borders around the colour to make them even more distinctive. Banners weren't just military units, they became identities. When someone asked, "Who are you?" the first answer was often, "I belong to the plain yellow banner," or "I am from the bordered blue banner." And that told almost everything important. Being part of a banner meant you trained from childhood. A young boy, or sometimes even a young girl, might start by learning to ride a horse before they could properly walk. Archery lessons began early. At first, the bows felt too big and too stiff, but over time the children grew into them. They practiced shooting from still ground, then from a walking horse, then from a galloping one, and eventually they could hit targets behind them while riding full speed forward. Not bad for people who lived in a frozen forest half the year. But the 8 banners were not all about fighting. They organised farming, hunting, and trade. They kept records of families, marriages, property, and duties. They ensured elderly members were cared for. They handled justice and disputes. In many ways, a banner was like a mini-country, self-contained, self-managed, and built on loyalty. If someone caused trouble, the whole banner felt it. If someone achieved greatness, the banner rose with them. As the banners grew stronger, something impressive happened. They became incredibly efficient fighting forces. While Ming armies often showed up late, disorganized, or hungry, banner troops moved like clockwork. They knew their commanders. They knew their roles. They trusted the people beside them. When Nurhaci sent a message, the banners didn't scatter in confusion. They responded with speed that startled enemy generals. Some Ming officers even wondered if the Manchus had discovered a secret way to teleport. Part of the banner system's strength came from its fairness. Unlike many armies where only the wealthy or noble families led troops, in the banners leadership usually came from merit. If you were skilled, brave, and loyal, you rose. If you were lazy or didn't care, no fancy family name could save you from embarrassment. This gave the Manchus something the collapsing Ming often lacked: soldiers who actually believed in their leaders. Another advantage was mobility. Banner troops travelled light and travelled fast. They could break camp in minutes and move across frozen rivers, forests, and mountains with surprising ease. Their horses were small but unbelievably tough, able to survive off reeds and frozen grass. The Ming often brought wagons, heavy armour, and long supply lines. The Manchus brought horses, bows, and the determination of people who grew up in a land that never gave second chances. As Nurhaci's successors continued refining the banner system, it became more than a military tool. It became the engine of a rising nation. When battles came, banners worked together like the gears of a well-made machine. When peace returned, banners provided structure and identity. This combination of unity, discipline, and community made the Manchus nearly unstoppable. Even the Ming generals who laughed at the Manchus in the beginning stopped laughing pretty fast. By the time the Manchus were ready to move south and challenge the Ming Dynasty directly, the 8 banners were no longer just an idea. They were a nation, a living, breathing force. Families, warriors, farmers, elders, and children all woven together like threads of the same fabric. This fabric held strong through war, tragedy, and victory. And as the banners unfurled in the cold northern wind, they carried with them the future of an empire that had not yet been born, but was now impossible to stop. If you picture the Ming Dynasty in its final decades, imagine a giant wooden ship sailing through a storm. A beautiful ship. Yes. Painted sides, silk sails, proud history. But somewhere along the way the wood had started rotting. Not all at once, not loudly, but quietly, plank by plank. The waves didn't have to crash hard. They only had to keep coming. That was China in the late 1500s and early 1600s. Tired, leaking, and hoping the storm would magically stop on its own. Every part of the Ming government felt heavy and sluggish. Officials wrote long reports about disasters, hunger and rebellion, but the palace was drowning in so many scrolls that half of them sat unread. Some officials worked honestly. Many worked honestly at stealing. Taxes went up, rice went down, and the average person, farmer, merchant, soldier, felt the squeeze. A farmer once joked, "I don't know who eats my crops first, the locusts or the tax man," but no one laughed because the answer was usually both. Natural disasters hit like a string of bad luck that simply refused to end. Droughts arrived first, drying lakes into cracked bowls of earth. Then floods came because nature has a dark sense of humour. After that came famines, and after that came disease. Villages that had stood for generations suddenly emptied. Farmers wandered south searching for better land, carrying nothing but hope and a small sack of rice that never seemed full enough. As the disasters grew worse, so did the rebellions. Hungry people don't stay quiet forever. Small bands of angry peasants turned into roaming armies. Some rebels claimed to fight for justice. Some claimed to fight for heaven, and some claimed nothing at all. They just took what they needed and kept moving. The countryside became a patchwork of conflict, smoke rising from places where rice fields used to stand. One rebellion rose higher and faster than all the others, the uprising led by Li Zicheng. He wasn't born wealthy, he wasn't born noble, he was born hungry and angry, 2 qualities that, when mixed carefully, can change history. Li Zicheng gained followers because he promised something simple: food. The Ming government promised taxes, he promised survival. You can guess who people listened to. While rebels grew stronger, the Ming military grew weaker. Soldiers often hadn't been paid in months. Some hadn't been paid in years. When a general ordered troops to march, they sometimes replied, "Why?" Which is not a great sign for an empire trying to stay alive. Some soldiers deserted, some turned bandit, and some simply went home to farm, deciding that a small chance at rice was better than a big chance at dying for a government that couldn't afford boots. At the centre of it all sat the emperor, Kangxi, a man who inherited a sinking ship and tried desperately to plug every hole with his own hands. He wasn't lazy. He wasn't corrupt. He simply had too many problems and not enough time. Every messenger brought more bad news. Every report revealed another province in trouble. The poor man probably drank more tea than anyone in China, just trying to stay awake long enough to read all the scrolls. Corruption didn't help. Some officials exaggerated their victories. Others hid their failures. Many lied about the condition of their cities. One governor claimed his province was peaceful while rebels literally camped outside his city walls. By the time the emperor learned the truth, it was usually too late. Lies have a habit of growing legs and running faster than armies. Meanwhile, the Manchus were watching all of this from the north. They didn't need spies to see the Ming collapsing. The smoke rising from villages, the reports from traders, the stories carried by refugees all told the same tale. China was tired, China was breaking, and when a giant breaks, smaller powers don't rush in wildly, they take their time. The Manchus waited, prepared, and strengthened their banners, knowing opportunity was walking toward them like a traveller with no shoes. By the time Li Zicheng's rebellion surged across the land, by the time starving peasants opened city gates and desperate officials fled their posts, the Ming Dynasty was more shadow than substance. It hadn't fully fallen yet, but it was leaning so far that the next strong wind might push it over. That wind was coming, from the north, from the banners, from a people who had watched, waited, and grown strong while the Ming crumbled piece by piece. The fall had begun, and there was no turning back. If the fall of the Ming Dynasty was a long winter, then Emperor Chongzhen was the last lonely tree standing in the snow. He didn't choose this destiny. He didn't ask to rule during the empire's most miserable years, but when he stepped onto the throne in 1627, China handed him a giant pile of problems and said, "Good luck." From the day he put on the dragon robe, the weight of 3 centuries pressed down on his shoulders like a very heavy, very unhappy backpack. Chongzhen wasn't lazy. He wasn't wicked. He wasn't even incompetent. He was just one man trying to fix a collapsing empire with tools that were already broken. He reduced waste. He punished corruption. He tried to cut unnecessary expenses. The problem? Every time he fixed one leak, 3 new ones appeared. Running the Ming government was like trying to sweep water off a sinking boat with a feather duster. And then there were the officials. Some were loyal and hard-working, others not so much. Many had spent years stuffing silver into their sleeves, and when Chongzhen tried to stop them, they suddenly remembered very important family emergencies in distant provinces. The emperor fired corrupt ministers left and right, but firing people doesn't magically replace them with better options. Soon he had fewer trusted advisors and even less time to think. Meanwhile, Li Zicheng's rebellion was growing like a bonfire in dry grass. Every failure of the government pushed more hungry peasants into his arms. Every tax increase made another village switch sides. Chongzhen knew the danger and he tried everything, raising troops, cutting expenses, sending envoys, but his resources were shrinking while Li Zicheng's were swelling like a river after rain. The emperor was fighting a flood with a single wooden bucket. What made it even worse was betrayal. Chongzhen had trusted certain generals deeply, men he believed were loyal, but when the rebels grew stronger, some of these commanders hesitated, froze, or changed sides entirely. A few surrendered cities without firing a shot. Others simply ran away. Imagine trying to play chess while half your pieces secretly decide they like the other player better. Inside the Forbidden City, the emperor grew thinner, sleep-deprived, and more desperate. He worked late into the night, reading reports that offered little hope. He skipped meals. He blamed himself for everything. He once said, "If the empire falls, it is my fault alone." Those words carried sadness, but also truth. He didn't fail because he didn't care. He failed because the Ming Dynasty had become too large, too heavy, and too wounded to save. By the spring of 1644, the walls closed in. Rebel forces marched on Beijing faster than officials expected. Troops sent to defend the capital never returned. The emperor called for more soldiers, but none came. He ordered supplies that no longer existed. He begged the heavens for help, but the sky remained silent. In the palace courtyards, cherry blossoms fell like pink snow while the city braced for the end. When Li Zicheng finally reached Beijing, panic spread like wildfire. Gates crumbled, soldiers deserted, crowds yelled and scattered in every direction. Inside the Forbidden City, Chongzhen realized something terrible. The dynasty his ancestors built over nearly 3 centuries had reached its final chapter. No secret army was coming, no miracle general, no last-minute rescue. It was just him and the quiet halls of a palace that suddenly felt too big and too empty. The emperor gathered his family and gave final instructions. Some begged him to flee south, others cried. Chongzhen refused to run. He believed an emperor should not abandon his capital, and so, in the early hours of a cold, grey morning, he walked to Coal Hill overlooking the Forbidden City, wearing a plain robe instead of imperial gold. He carried nothing but sorrow. The wind blew gently, almost respectfully, as if the world understood that a dynasty was ending. Chongzhen's final moments were quiet. No crowd, no advisors, no soldiers, just a tired man who tried his best in a time far bigger than himself. When he ended his life beneath a lonely tree, the Ming Dynasty died with him. His last message asked forgiveness from the people he failed and cursed the traitorous officials who had abandoned him. And as the sun rose over Beijing, rebels marched into a city without a master, unaware that a new power, the Manchus, was already watching, waiting, and preparing to claim the empire that had slipped from Chongzhen's hands. When Emperor Chongzhen died on Coal Hill, Beijing became a city that suddenly forgot how to breathe. The Forbidden City, once filled with whispers of servants and rustle of silk robes, now felt hollow, like a drum with the skin torn off. No emperor walked its halls, no orders came from its throne. The dragon seat sat empty in a palace that had never known silence. Outside the walls, the city trembled, unsure whether to hide, run, or simply wait for whatever storm would sweep in next. Li Zicheng, the rebel leader who had clawed his way from poverty to power, entered the city with pride swelling in his chest. To him, this was victory. Final, brilliant, deserved. Beijing, the heart of the empire, had fallen not to foreign invaders but to a man who once herded goats. His armies marched through the gates wearing mismatched armor and determined expressions, looking less like a polished imperial force and more like a parade that somehow made it into the capital by accident. At first, the people of Beijing didn't know whether to cheer, cry, or hide under their beds. Some had starved for months and simply wanted food. Others feared rebels as much as they feared corrupt officials, and some just wanted someone, anyone, who could keep the city from falling apart completely. Li Zicheng promised fairness, stability, lower taxes, and justice. The problem was that promises made during victory speeches are easy. Keeping them is much harder, especially when the entire region is a powder keg. Inside the palace, Li Zicheng tried to act like an emperor, but the throne room swallowed him. He walked through halls built for the Ming Dynasty and felt the weight of history pressing on his shoulders, reminding him he did not belong here. He sat on the dragon throne briefly, but even he sensed the seat was not meant for him. Power is heavy. The more he held it, the heavier it became, like trying to wear a robe 10 sizes too big. Worse yet, discipline among his rebel troops slipped almost immediately. Soldiers who had marched bravely in battle suddenly found themselves surrounded by silk, gold, wine, and 100 temptations they had never seen before. Some looted, some argued, some drank until the palace echoed with noise. Li Zicheng tried to restore order, but rebels who fight well don't always govern well. The capital began to crack from the inside faster than he could repair it. Meanwhile, word of Beijing's fall spread across the empire like wildfire. Officials panicked. Merchants hid their treasures. Peasants wondered whether life would finally improve or simply become another kind of suffering. And to the far north, in the icy lands of Manchuria, the Manchus heard the news with quiet satisfaction. The gate had opened. The Ming had fallen. But the rebels inside Beijing were not strong enough to hold what they had taken. A city without a master is an invitation, and the Manchus had been waiting for that invitation for years. Inside Beijing, the cracks grew wider. Li Zicheng's quick victory created quick expectations. The city wanted food, money, safety, order. He tried, but rebellion leaders often discover that running a government is much harder than shouting slogans. He lacked skilled administrators. He lacked long-term plans. He lacked the trust of scholars and nobles who viewed him as a bandit wearing fancy clothes. The palace, once a symbol of power, became a giant echoing headache. Rumours began swirling that the Manchus were approaching. Some said they were already marching. Some said they had allied with Ming generals. Some said they were preparing to restore order in China, which sounded nice, until you realised that restore order often means take everything. People whispered in tea houses, markets and alleyways. Beijing had fallen once already. No one wanted to see it fall again, but no one trusted the new regime to protect it either. Li Zicheng tried to rally his troops, but the confidence they had in the countryside dissolved the moment they faced the thought of Manchu cavalry sweeping down from the mountains. The rebels were tired from months of marching. Supplies were low, morale was lower, and discipline, which had never been perfect, was now a memory. A capital needs strength to hold. Beijing had none. The city was like a sandcastle waiting for the next wave. And so Beijing, huge, ancient, once the beating heart of the Ming Dynasty, stood in the strange space between empires. Not Ming, not Qing, not truly controlled by Li Zicheng. It was a city without a master, a city drifting, a city waiting. Far to the northeast, a stronger, more organized force was preparing to enter the story. The Manchus were ready, their banners were ready, their leaders were ready, and Beijing, tired and wounded, was about to meet its next ruler. When Beijing fell and the Ming Dynasty collapsed into dust, the future of China unexpectedly rested on the shoulders of a single man, Wu Sangui. He wasn't a poet or a scholar, he wasn't a rebel or a dreamer. He was a soldier, a very good one, with a fortress, an army, and a decision that would end one dynasty and give birth to another. Think of him as the man standing at a gate holding a key, and 2 huge armies are knocking at the same time, both yelling, "Let us in!" Wu Sangui guarded Shanhai Pass, one of the most important gateways in China, where the Great Wall meets the sea. Whoever controlled this pass controlled the doorway between Manchuria and the vast heartland of the empire. Wu knew its value. Everyone knew its value. Even the pass itself probably knew, judging by how many armies had marched toward it over centuries. And now, with rebels on one side and Manchus on the other, Wu stood at the center of history like a man caught between two doors and two storms. Wu Sangui's situation was messy, very messy. Li Zicheng, the rebel who had taken Beijing, sent friendly letters inviting Wu to join the revolution. Friendly is a generous word, of course. When someone conquers the capital and then invites you to join them, the invitation sounds more like, say yes or we'll ask again with swords. Wu didn't trust Li. He didn't trust rebels at all. He believed them unpredictable, undisciplined and dangerous. But trusting the Ming Dynasty was hard too, mostly because the dynasty didn't exist anymore. The emperor was dead, Beijing was lost. Ming loyalists were scattered like leaves in a storm. Some fled south, some hid. Some pretended to be very small rocks hoping rebels wouldn't notice them. Wu Sangui felt torn between loyalty to a dynasty that had vanished and fear of a rebel regime that didn't seem capable of ruling anything larger than a village market. Just when things seemed impossible, another letter arrived, this time from the Manchus. Their message was polite, strategic, and surprisingly charming. They offered alliance. They promised help against Li Zicheng. They promised protection for Wu's family and soldiers. They even offered titles and rewards. The Manchus, who had been waiting patiently like hunters watching an injured deer, suddenly stepped forward with open hands and very sharp swords hidden behind polite smiles. Wu Sangui hesitated. He hesitated long enough for history to hold its breath. On one hand, teaming up with the rebels felt risky. On the other hand, letting the Manchus into China felt even riskier. But then news arrived, news sharp enough to break any hesitation. Li Zicheng's men had taken Wu's family in Beijing. Some accounts say they threatened them, some say worse. Some say they mistreated Wu's favourite concubine, Chen Yuanyuan, a woman known for her beauty and grace. Whether rumour or truth, these reports struck Wu like a hammer. Anger works fast, faster than logic, faster than politics. In that heated moment, Wu Sangui made the decision that would change the fate of China. He would open the gates of Shanhai Pass to the Manchus. Some say he yelled, "I'll fight Li Zicheng with my last breath." Others say he simply whispered to himself, "Fine. If I can't trust rebels, I'll trust warriors." Whatever he said, the choice was made. The door to empire swung open. When the Manchu army poured through the pass, it wasn't a trickle, it was a storm. Thousands of riders, disciplined and organized, thundering across the plains with the sound of hooves like rolling war drums. Wu Sangui's forces joined them, forming an alliance built not on trust or friendship, but on shared anger and desperate timing. Together they turned toward Beijing, where Li Zicheng quickly realized that holding a capital is much harder when two armies want it back. The battle that followed was fierce and fast. The rebels weren't ready. Their morale had already cracked. Their discipline had already slipped. And when the Manchus added their legendary cavalry to the fight, Li Zicheng's forces broke like thin ice under heavy boots. Beijing fell again, this time not to rebels, but to the combined power of a betrayed general and a rising northern empire. After the battle, Wu Sangui looked at the ruins, the smoke and the future he had just helped shape. Some say he regretted opening the gates. Some say he insisted he did the right thing. But the truth is simple. His decision allowed the Manchus to claim Beijing and eventually the entire empire. His choice became the hinge on which Chinese history swung, and once the doors of Shanhai Pass opened, they never closed again. When the Manchus finally entered Beijing, the city's air still smelled of smoke and fear. Towers stood cracked, gates hung crooked, people whispered in the streets, wondering who would rule them now. Into this uncertain world stepped a child, small, quiet, wide-eyed, the boy who would become the Shunzhi Emperor. He wasn't even 7 years old, and yet, in the echoing halls of the Forbidden City, he became the symbol of a new dynasty rising from the ruins of the old. The boy's real name was Fulin. He was thoughtful, gentle, and curious, traits that sound lovely in a child but terrifying in a world full of warlords, generals, and scheming officials. When he arrived in Beijing, he looked at the enormous palace with a mix of wonder and confusion. Imagine being a child asked to rule a country that still hadn't finished sweeping up the ashes from the last battle. It was like being handed a ship's wheel during a storm and being told, "Don't crash." Of course, a child emperor doesn't rule alone. Standing behind Shunzhi like a towering mountain was Prince Dorgan, the regent. Dorgan was smart, disciplined, experienced, and sometimes a little scary. He became the real driver of the early Qing government. If the empire was a horse, Dorgan held the reins. Shunzhi was the polite kid sitting on the saddle waving at people. It wasn't his fault. He was still learning how to read tricky officials and survive palace politics. Dorgan introduced new policies immediately. Some were helpful, some were unpopular, some were, let's call them, bold choices. He ordered Han Chinese men to adopt the Manchu hairstyle, the shaved forehead and long braided queue. Many hated the rule, but refusing meant punishment. Dorgan also reorganized land, promoted loyal officials, and strengthened the banner system inside the city. Every decision he made shaped how the Qing dynasty would rule for centuries. But while adults argued about policy, the young Shunzhi Emperor lived in a world somewhere between childhood and duty. He studied every day: philosophy, ethics, language, history. Tutors lectured him until his head probably felt like a stuffed dumpling. Between lessons, he wandered the gardens, fed palace birds, and asked his attendants endless questions. He was fascinated by the Han people and wanted to understand their customs, stories, and fears. Maybe he sensed that an empire cannot be ruled with force alone. Life inside the Forbidden City moved in rhythms he slowly learned. The early morning drum, the quiet shuffle of servants, the echo of shoes on stone, the distant call of guards during night patrol. The palace was grand but lonely. Its walls protected him from danger but also from friendship. He watched officials bow so deeply their hats almost fell off, yet few dared speak to him honestly. Even as emperor, he remained a boy searching for people he could trust. Outside the palace, the early Qing government struggled to stabilize the empire. Rebellions weren't fully gone. Ming loyalists still fought in the south. Taxes needed fixing. Armies needed supplies. Roads needed repair. Every province sent problems faster than the court could answer them. Dorgan worked tirelessly, though some whispered that he enjoyed the power a little too much. Meanwhile, Shunzhi listened, learned, and tried not to get crushed under the mountain of responsibilities waiting for him. Despite the chaos, something new grew inside the capital, a sense of strange, cautious hope. The Manchu rulers were foreign, yes, but they were organized, disciplined, decisive. Farmers noticed bandits disappearing from the roads. Merchants noticed taxes becoming more predictable. Scholars noticed the court actually reading reports instead of piling them in dusty corners. People weren't exactly cheering, but they were watching carefully, thinking, maybe, just maybe, these newcomers can fix what the Ming could not. Over time, the boy emperor began stepping out of Dorgan's shadow. He studied late into the night. He asked questions during council meetings. He made suggestions, some good, some naive, all earnest. When he turned 12, he officially began exercising real authority. Some ministers were surprised, others were nervous. But Shunzhi had grown, not just in height but in wisdom. He wanted to rule with compassion, fairness, and understanding, a rare combination in any era. Though his reign was short, only 12 years, the young Shunzhi Emperor laid foundations that shaped the Qing for generations. He calmed conflicts, strengthened the government, and opened the door for the golden age that would come under the next ruler, the Kangxi Emperor. Shunzi's time on the throne was brief, like a candle that burned quickly but brightly. Yet in those years he helped transform the Qing from conquerors into true rulers of China. When Shunzhi passed away, the Forbidden City once again felt like a cold, echoing maze. Ministers whispered. Eunuchs looked worried. Generals stared at the floor. Everyone wondered what would happen next. The Qing dynasty was still young, still fragile, still trying to settle its feet in a land it had just conquered. But history has a habit of surprising people at the worst and best moments. From within the palace walls, a new ruler stepped forward, a child named Xuanye, only 8 years old, who would later be known as the Kangxi Emperor, one of the greatest rulers China ever had. Kangxi wasn't supposed to be extraordinary. He was just a boy, small, bright-eyed, full of curiosity. But sometimes greatness shows up early. He watched everything around him with sharp attention. How ministers bowed, how generals argued, how eunuchs whispered in corners. While most children worried about toys, he worried about rebellions. While other kids practiced calligraphy for fun, he practiced because one day the survival of an empire would depend on the steadiness of his hand. But of course, a child emperor didn't rule alone. 4 regents had been appointed to guide him. One of them, a boy, quickly decided he liked power way too much. He began giving orders as if he were emperor himself, dismissing officials he disliked, bullying ministers, and using his influence to shape the court. Many feared him more than they respected him. Kangxi watched all this quietly, storing every detail in his memory like a boy planning a very patient revenge. Growing up in a palace full of politics wasn't easy. Kangxi's daily schedule would exhaust a grown adult. Lessons in military strategy at dawn, governance in the late morning, philosophical texts in the afternoon, and etiquette training after dinner. Still, he absorbed it all. The boy had a mind like a dry sponge thrown into a bucket of water. Everything soaked in quickly. When he wasn't studying, he practiced archery and horseback riding, determined to master the skills expected of a Manchu emperor. As the years passed, Kangxi grew taller and sharper. Ministers began to realize the boy they had treated like a delicate flower was turning into a very sturdy tree. He asked better questions. He challenged unfair orders. He memorized long reports and confronted officials who tried to lie. And slowly, quietly, he prepared for the moment when he would take full control. History often loves dramatic moments. Kangxi preferred patience. His first major test came when he decided to remove a boy, the powerful regent who had treated the government like his personal playground. This wasn't easy. Oboy controlled guards, ministers, and a whole network of loyal supporters. But Kangxi wasn't reckless. He waited until Oboy relaxed, until he thought the child emperor was still harmless. Then, at the perfect moment, Kangxi captured him in a swift palace operation that probably left half the court speechless. The boy emperor, barely 14, removed the most dangerous man in the empire without spilling a drop of blood. With Oboy gone, Kangxi finally stepped into his own power, and once he began ruling it became clear he was not ordinary. He held long meetings with ministers, listened carefully to generals, and studied every province as if he were memorizing a giant living map. He cared about irrigation, taxes, education, roads, and even how much grain cost in distant regions. He wanted to know everything, not because he was nosy, but because he believed a ruler must understand the people he governs. Then came the campaigns. The Qing Dynasty still faced threats: Ming loyalists in the south, rebels in Taiwan, hostile tribes in the frontier. Instead of hiding behind palace walls, Kangxi personally led his armies. He rode through snowstorms, crossed rivers, and camped in freezing tents beside his soldiers. They loved him for it. A ruler who shares the cold earns loyalty much faster than a ruler who shares only speeches. Back in Beijing, he brought stability, he encouraged scholarship, repaired infrastructure, improved the legal system, and reduced corruption, sometimes by surprising officials with unexpected inspections. Imagine an emperor suddenly showing up at your office asking why your paperwork looks suspicious. Corrupt ministers didn't sleep well during Kangxi's reign. Honest ones, on the other hand, praised him endlessly. Kangxi ruled for 61 years, the longest reign in Chinese history. He entered the throne as a small boy and left it as a legend. Under his guidance, the Qing Dynasty became strong, stable, and prosperous. He blended military strength with compassion, intelligence with patience, and tradition with curiosity about the wider world. And as he stood on palace balconies in his later years, watching the empire thrive below, he became the living symbol of what a great ruler could be. A man shaped by hardship, sharpened by study, and remembered for harmony. When the Qing dynasty settled into Beijing and the dust of war finally began to fade, something interesting happened. The swords grew quiet, the horses rested, the banners folded neatly. And for the first time in years, the empire could breathe. With peace came a new question. How do you unite millions of people who speak different languages, wear different clothes, follow different customs, and remember different histories? The answer did not come through battles. It came through culture. Soft, gentle, patient, like a river smoothing a stone. The Manchus had conquered China, yes, but they quickly realized something important. The Han people were the majority, and the empire would never stand if these two worlds stayed divided. So instead of forcing the Han to become Manchu, the Qing court tried something more clever. They adopted many Chinese traditions while keeping their own identity alive. It was a cultural handshake, firm, careful, and meant to last. One of the earliest steps was language. Manchu was the ruling group's native tongue, but most people in the empire spoke various forms of Chinese. Instead of choosing one over the other, the Qing encouraged the court to use both. Imperial documents were written in two scripts, scholars learned both languages, even palace signs had bilingual carvings. In a world that often demanded people pick a side, the Qing said, why not both? Clothing became another way cultures blended. Manchu nobles wore long robes with narrow sleeves perfect for riding horses. Han scholars preferred wide sleeves that flowed like poetry in cloth form. So the Qing court mixed styles, long horsetail coats for officials, but still elegant silk robes for scholars. The empire looked like a living fashion show where two traditions walked the runway together without arguing. Art also wove cultures together. Painters mixed Manchu hunting scenes with Chinese landscape styles. Calligraphers experimented with both scripts. Artisans crafted porcelain that blended northern boldness with southern elegance. Even palace architecture carried traces of two worlds. Manchu practicality shaping the layout, Chinese aesthetics shaping the beauty. The Forbidden City itself became a museum of unity, every hall whispering stories from both sides of the wall. The court also poured tremendous energy into scholarship. The Kangxi Emperor, who loved knowledge as much as he loved riding horses, launched huge cultural projects. One was the Kangxi Dictionary, a massive book that organized Chinese characters more clearly than ever before. It was like creating a tidy bookshelf for an entire language. Scholars worked for years, dipping brushes into ink until their hands cramped. When the book was finished, it became a treasure for generations. The Qing also supported astronomy, mathematics, cartography, and medicine. Jesuit missionaries brought European knowledge, telescopes, clocks, star charts. The emperor invited them into the palace, not as conquerors, but as teachers. They showed court astronomers how planets moved, how clocks kept time, and how maps could be drawn with precision. The Qing embraced this knowledge like a gift, blending it with Chinese tradition to create something new and powerful. Music and festivals also played a role. Manchu drums echoed through palace courtyards during ceremonies, while Han string instruments filled tea houses with gentle melodies. Imperial celebrations combined hunting traditions from the north with elegant rituals from the south. During festivals, people wore bright colours, shared dumplings, lit lanterns, and told stories, some from Manchu memory, some from Chinese history. The empire became a tapestry woven from 1,000 threads. Over time, the boundaries between cultures softened. A Manchu child might study Confucian classics. A Han child might admire the skills of Manchu horse archers. Merchants traded goods across regions. Scholars debated philosophy across ethnic lines. It wasn't perfect. There were tensions, disagreements, and moments of resistance. But compared to the chaos that came before, the Qing era began to feel like a long exhale. Unity wasn't forced. It was grown, like a garden watched carefully through every season. By embracing both Manchu and Han traditions, the early Qing dynasty built stability not just through power, but through understanding. Culture became the bridge that linked conqueror and conquered, different but equal parts of a single empire. And as the Qing moved into its golden years, these blended traditions formed the foundation for peace, prosperity, and creativity. In the quiet halls of Beijing, one truth became clear: an empire lasts longest when its people share not just borders, but stories. Even after the Qing dynasty settled into its new capital and blended cultures into something stable and elegant, the empire was far from quiet. To the west stretched lands so wide and wild that travellers often joked you could ride for days and only meet one lonely goat who looked annoyed at seeing you. These frontiers, Tibet, Xinjiang, Mongolia, the deserts, the mountains, were worlds of their own. And if the Qing wanted lasting peace, they needed to understand these lands, guide them, and sometimes fight for them. The frontier was beautiful, but beauty didn't keep armies away. Rival groups, independent leaders, and ambitious khans all had their eyes on these regions. Some wanted freedom, some wanted land, some simply wanted to test their strength. The Qing court understood that if the borders cracked, the whole empire could shake. So they prepared not just with weapons, but with patience, diplomacy, and a very long-distance walking problem called campaigning. One of the first major challenges came from Taiwan in the southeast. After the Ming Dynasty collapsed, Loyalist forces fled there and built a stronghold, almost like saying, "We're not done yet." The island had thick forests, powerful ships, and warriors ready to defend it. The Qing had to send fleets, negotiate with stubborn leaders, and fight several battles before finally bringing Taiwan under imperial rule. It was a reminder that winning the capital doesn't mean winning the whole country. Farther west, the empire faced an even bigger challenge: the Dzunga Khanate. These Mongol warriors were skilled riders, fierce fighters, and absolutely not interested in being told what to do. The Qing understood the Dzungas were strong enough to threaten entire regions, so they approached carefully, sending envoys, offering alliances, and watching the political winds like hunters studying tracks in the snow. But diplomacy can only go so far. When talks failed, the Qing mobilized their armies. These weren't the ragged bandit fighters of old Ming times. Banner troops under Kangxi were disciplined, organized, and battle-tested. They traveled with speed and efficiency across deserts, mountains, and frozen plains. Soldiers carried everything they needed, including determination, which weighed nothing but could carry them for 1,000 miles. The campaigns against the Dzungas were long and harsh. Armies marched through lands where the wind could cut like a knife, and water was more precious than gold. Some days they faced blinding dust storms. Other days they crossed mountain passes where snow fell in thick, silent sheets. The Qing soldiers learned quickly that the frontier did not allow mistakes, but step by step, battle by battle, they pushed forward. Tibet became another important region in the Qing's westward picture. Its temples, mountains, and spiritual traditions held enormous influence. When political tension rose there, Kangxi sent envoys and troops, not to conquer blindly, but to stabilize the region and maintain peace. The monks watched carefully, the nobles whispered nervously, and the Qing court tried to balance respect with authority. Governing Tibet was less like holding a sword and more like holding a bowl of water. Tilt too much one way, and everything spills. Despite the harsh conditions, the frontier campaigns forged a stronger empire. Soldiers who survived gained pride and loyalty. Generals who succeeded earned trust and honor. Roads were improved. New trade routes opened. The Qing gained control over regions that earlier dynasties struggled to manage. And slowly the enormous borderlands, grasslands, deserts, mountains, and plateaus began to connect with the heart of the empire like distant limbs returning feeling. Of course, military strength alone wasn't enough to hold the frontier. The Qing built alliances with local leaders, offered titles, respected cultural customs, and allowed regional autonomy when possible. Instead of crushing every rival, they used strategy, reward loyalty, punish betrayal, and understand the people who lived in these lands. The western frontier wasn't won by force alone, it was won by a mixture of toughness and tact. By the end of these campaigns, the Qing dynasty stood taller than ever, its borders stretched wider, its armies were tested and proven, its influence reached across deserts, over mountains, and through valleys that echoed with new alliances. The empire had become not just a conqueror, but a guardian of vast frontiers. And as the sunset glowed across the western horizon, the Qing knew they had built something stronger than any single victory, an empire that understood the importance of both the blade and the handshake. By the time the Qing dynasty secured its frontiers and strengthened its rule, the empire stood like a massive, calm giant. But even giants have neighbours, and the world outside China was changing fast. Oceans were no longer barriers, they were highways. Foreign ships, strange shapes on the horizon with tall masts and loud cannons, sailed along Asia's coastline. And though the Qing preferred stability over surprise, it could not ignore the new world knocking at its gates. For centuries, China had operated under the tribute system. Kings, chiefs, and envoys from neighbouring lands travelled to Beijing, bowed to the emperor, and offered gifts: silk, spices, horses, jewels. In return, the Qing granted them titles, trade rights, and sometimes extremely fancy robes. It was a system built on ritual and respect, and the Qing were very comfortable with it. But Europeans didn't understand this system at all. They thought trade should be based on equality, not ceremony. When diplomats bowed awkwardly in the wrong places or refused the right titles, both sides ended up confused. The Jesuits, however, were different. These European scholars arrived not as conquerors but as curious learners. They studied Chinese language, philosophy, and customs with surprising dedication. In return, they offered knowledge about astronomy, mathematics, clocks, maps, and even painting techniques. The Qing were impressed. Kangxi especially liked talking with Jesuit astronomers, who explained stars with a clarity that sparked the emperor's imagination. For a moment, two very different worlds shared tea and ideas. Through these exchanges, China updated its astronomical calendar, improved map-making, and gained new medical knowledge. Jesuit artists even blended European shading techniques with Chinese brushwork, creating paintings that felt like a gentle handshake between continents. But even with this cultural bridge, the Qing kept a careful distance. They welcomed knowledge, but not domination. They allowed trade, but only on their own terms. The centre of international trade became Guangzhou, a bustling port city where merchants from Britain, Portugal, the Netherlands, and other nations waited eagerly for tea, porcelain, silk, and other valuable Chinese goods. The Qing allowed foreign traders to operate only in designated areas and only during specific seasons. This kept things orderly and prevented chaos. Foreign merchants complained about the rules, but they still came back every year because China's goods were simply too good to resist. But not everything was smooth. Western nations wanted more access, more ports, more trade privileges. The Qing responded with polite refusals. They believed China was self-sufficient and saw no reason to open the entire country to foreigners who seemed impatient and loud. To the Qing, foreign demands felt like a child asking for more candy even after being told no. To Europeans, the Qing seemed stubborn and outdated. Misunderstandings grew quietly, like cracks beneath a frozen lake. Beyond China, the world was shifting. Empires rose and fell across Asia. Russia expanded eastward through Siberia, reaching China's northern borders. The two sides negotiated carefully, sometimes tensely, and eventually signed the Treaty of Nurhaci, China's first formal treaty with a European nation. This agreement showed that the Qing were capable not only of military power, but also of diplomacy on a global scale. They could draw boundaries with pens instead of swords. Trade was not only international, it also thrived within China. Caravans travelled across the empire, carrying everything from salt to horses to tea bricks. Merchants crossed rivers, deserts and mountains, connecting distant regions like strands of a giant web. Markets buzzed with colour and noise. Silk sellers haggled loudly. Spice merchants tempted shoppers with fragrant baskets. Even storytellers earned coins by entertaining crowds with tales of faraway lands. Economic life pulsed across the Qing like a steady heartbeat. Yet through all the noise of trade, diplomacy and global contact, the Qing rulers maintained a strong sense of identity. They saw themselves not as conquerors or imitators, but as protectors of harmony. They welcomed useful knowledge, rejected unnecessary interference, and believed stability was more important than ambition. Their worldview was slow, careful, and deeply rooted in tradition. To them, the outside world was interesting, but also unpredictable. As foreign ships arrived and global winds shifted, the Qing dynasty stood like a mountain, steady, dignified, and cautiously observant. Trade brought wealth, diplomacy brought knowledge, and although future storms would someday roar across China's shores, during the Kangxi era, the empire felt balanced between old and new. The world was changing, yes, but so was China, adapting quietly, like bamboo bending in the wind without breaking. While emperors commanded armies and officials wrote long reports that nobody wanted to read, most people in the Qing dynasty lived quiet, ordinary lives far from palaces and battlefields. Their world was made of rice fields, dusty roads, open markets, family houses, gossip under willow trees, and the slow rhythm of seasons. To understand the Qing dynasty, you don't start with soldiers. You start with farmers, merchants, scholars, and mothers rocking babies beside warm stoves. History is loud at the top, but peaceful at the bottom. In the countryside, farmers woke before sunrise. The roosters crowed, dogs barked, and the first pots of porridge began simmering. Men and women tied up their sleeves, grabbed hoes, and headed to the fields. Rice was life. Millet was life. Wheat was life. A good harvest meant a full stomach. A bad one meant long, worried nights. But even on hard days, the mountains stood steady around them, and the rivers ran as they always had, giving comfort in a world that often felt unpredictable. The marketplace was the beating heart of every town. Vendors shouted prices from behind wooden stalls. Spice sellers waved tiny fans over their baskets, sending warm cinnamon and pepper scents drifting through the air. Silk merchants bragged about their fabrics. Butchers called customers good friends, even if they had never met them. Children ran between stalls chasing each other, while old men played board games in shady corners, pretending not to care who won but caring very much. Inside each home, life flowed around a courtyard. Families gathered there to cook, eat, chat, and dry laundry under the sun. On winter nights, everyone moved closer to the brazier, warming their hands while sharing stories their grandparents once told. Homes were simple: wood, brick, clay, and love. If you listened closely, you could hear the sound of soup simmering, babies laughing, and someone playing a bamboo flute while neighbours politely pretended not to hear the off-key notes. Education played a huge role in society. Scholars studied beside oil lamps late into the night, memorising Confucian classics one character at a time. Their dreams were filled not with dragons or adventure, but with passing exams. The imperial examination system was a ladder that led to respect, office, and security. Many tried climbing, few reached the top. Still, student life had its charms: long debates, poetry recitals, tea shops full of chatter, and the reassuring sound of a friend whispering, "I have no idea what this text means either." Merchants, though sometimes looked down upon by scholars, travelled constantly. They crossed dusty plains with caravans, followed river routes on wooden boats, and bargained loudly at inns where everyone complained about the food but ate it anyway. They carried porcelain, tea, salt and silk from one region to another. Their journeys connected the empire like threads in a giant quilt, and every coin earned came with a story, some true, some exaggerated, all entertaining. Women held the household together. They wove cloth, managed finances, raised children, cooked meals, and kept the moral backbone of families firm. Some worked in fields, some ran small shops. Some became respected matriarchs whose opinions carried more weight than any official document. Their strength didn't come from titles or uniforms. It came from patience, resilience, and knowing exactly where everything in the house was stored even when nobody else did. Religious and spiritual life also shaped daily routines. Temples dotted the landscape. Buddhist, Taoist, and folk shrines dedicated to local gods who protected everything from crops to childbirth to passing exams. Villagers lit incense, offered fruit, and whispered prayers for good luck. Some prayed loudly, hoping the gods were hard of hearing. Others prayed quietly, hoping the gods preferred subtlety. Festivals filled the calendar with lanterns, drums, dancing lions, and enough fireworks to shake the next province awake. Meanwhile, the banner families inside Beijing had their own routines. Bannermen trained on horseback, practiced archery, and patrolled the capital. Their wives and children lived in special banner quarters, where life blended military discipline with ordinary family warmth. You might hear the clack of arrows being loosed in training yards, or children chasing each other between rows of barracks. It was a world apart from the countryside, but still full of laughter, chores, traditions, and the smell of noodles boiling somewhere nearby. Together, these millions of small lives, farmers, scholars, merchants, mothers, soldiers, created the heartbeat of the early Qing Dynasty. The empire looked grand from above, but its strength came from below, from the ordinary people rising each morning to work, love, argue, laugh, dream, and hope. They didn't read history books, they lived them, and as the Qing era moved forward, it was these everyday rhythms that held the empire steady while emperors and generals shaped its fate. By the time the early Qing dynasty secured its borders, calmed rebellions, blended cultures, and rebuilt Beijing into a thriving capital, the empire stood on the edge of something rare: stability. True stability. The kind that feels like a long, slow breath after years of running uphill. The storms of conquest were over, the dust of war had settled, and rising above it all, firm, steady, confident, was a dynasty that had transformed from outsider warriors to rightful rulers of one of the largest empires on earth. The Manchus had entered China as conquerors, but they stayed as architects of a new political order, a new cultural balance, a new world. Under Kangxi and the leaders who followed him, the Qing dynasty became something more than a military success story. It became a functional, stable system where laws were fairer, taxes were steadier, and decisions were made with a long-term vision rather than panic. After decades of fear, the people felt a rare and precious sensation: hope. With security came prosperity. Farmers planted with confidence, no longer terrified that rebels would trample their fields. Markets buzzed again. merchants shouting prices with renewed enthusiasm. Canals were repaired, allowing boats full of grain and goods to travel smoothly between regions. Trade routes expanded, taxes were predictable, and the once shaky foundation of the empire began to feel rock solid. When a dynasty feeds its people well, they repay it with loyalty stronger than iron. Education blossomed, schools reopened, exam halls buzzed with the scratch of brushes, and scholars found new purpose. Poetry thrived. Calligraphy competitions filled tea shops with friendly arguments about whose strokes were most elegant. Libraries grew larger, their shelves filling with new works on philosophy, science, law, and art. Knowledge flowed not just in the capital, but throughout the provinces, carried by scholars who travelled like migrating birds seeking wisdom. Art and culture blossomed too. Palace painters blended Manchu strength with Han elegance, creating works that captured hunting scenes, serene landscapes, and tender family moments. Architecture grew grander yet softer, power and beauty balanced with surprising gentleness. Craftsmen carved jade with incredible precision. Musicians perfected ancient melodies. The empire became a gallery of creativity, each region adding its own colour to the great canvas. Diplomatically, the Qing stood tall. They managed borders with treaties instead of endless battles. They handled foreign demands with patience, sometimes stubbornly, sometimes gracefully. They maintained strong ties with Mongolia, Tibet, and other regions, not through fear but through careful negotiation, mutual benefit, and shared interests. The empire wasn't perfect, but it was steady, and in politics, steady is priceless. Inside the Forbidden City, the court ran like a well-oiled mechanism. Ministers filed reports, banner officers maintained order, palace eunuchs moved quietly through endless corridors, and the emperor, whoever he was at the time, oversaw it all with the confidence born from decades of institutional strength. For the first time in generations, people across the land could predict tomorrow. That kind of certainty is a peaceful treasure most of history rarely offers. Of course, no empire exists without challenges. Crime still existed. Natural disasters still arrived. Some officials remained corrupt. But the Qing handled these problems with a confidence that came from stability rather than panic. When floods struck, relief supplies moved quickly. When famines threatened villages, granaries opened. When bandits appeared, banner troops responded swiftly. The empire didn't just survive, it learned how to manage crises without crumbling. Across the empire, families found peace. Husbands ploughed fields without listening for armies. Mothers raised children without fearing sudden fires or raids. Scholars studied, merchants travelled, artisans crafted, and monks prayed. In quiet towns lit by lanterns and echoing with laughter, life felt predictable in the best way. The empire had transformed from a conquered land into a home, one built on unity, structure, culture, and resilient spirit. And so the Qing dynasty rose, not in a single moment, not with a dramatic victory, but with years of discipline, patient governance, cultural blending, and careful leadership. The rise of the Qing was not the roar of a fire, it was the steady glow of one. From the rugged mountains of Manchuria to the bustling streets of Beijing, from frontier deserts to peaceful river towns, the empire found its identity. A dynasty that began as outsiders now stood proudly as the rulers of a united land. The storm had passed, the empire had ascended,